Moriden Athluan. Historians still seek to find out more about the mer whose actions ended the Fourth Era. Many are the tales that have been told of him, and most of them seem to contradict each other.
Most know him as the fabled Dragonborn of the Fourth Era, the savior of all Nirn, the mer who restored the lost dragon blood of the Septim line of emperors to all Mandus.
Some insist that he was a cunning thief. More insist that he was a warrior without compare. Still, others argue that he was a mage of unrivaled power.
There are whispers that he was a slave to the Daedric lords. Some even claim, in tales told in the darkest corners of Skyrim, that he was a vampire lord.
Like all legends, there are bits of truth hiding among the embellishments and the exaggerations. No single telling of the legend matches any others. But there are some few things that are always the same. The truth, however. The truth is not what the bards would have you believe. "21 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. Sergeant Hadvar was leading the scouting element as I had half expected. He and his men had already found a good overlook where they could keep a close eye on the goings-on in Fort Kastav, and his report when I arrived matched the information that Legate Ricka had given me a few hours before. The point of entry was a grate that had been, until recently, buried under the snow, and from its location, and what we know of the fort's interior arrangement, it likely opens directly into the prison area. All they needed was for me to get to it without being seen, enter, and clear the interior and free the prisoners. From there, arm them with whatever can be found and charge into the courtyard to catch the Stormcloaks completely unaware. Eyeballing the distance and knowing the hour was just after midnight, I figured that I'd be in during the middle of the midnight sentry watch, one of the hardest times to be aware and alert in the day. I nodded my agreement with the plan and began my approach. It took near an hour, and as I approached the grate I was very nearly spotted by a passing patroller overhead, but I made it into the fort unseen. The portion I was in required me to cross several rooms, only one of which had any Stormcloak presence. 3 of them, to be more precise. All died quickly and quietly. They weren't even awake enough to realize what was happening before it was all over. With the key to the cells now in my pockets, I quickly went down the stairs to the cells themselves, where I found our men in rags, freezing. The sight of me in my armor caused them to cheer until I silenced them. Though there weren't any more of the enemy in these rooms that I knew of, there was no reason to tempt fate. I informed them of the plan as I released them from their cells, and they all nodded as they grabbed weapons and spare armor bits from the walls. We massed by the door to the exterior to catch our breath and ready our nerves. Then, with a battle cry, poured from the prisons into the Skyrim night. The Battle of Fort Karstav, if it could even be called a battle, was over quickly. Once we broke from the prison cells and into the courtyard, it was nothing but chaos from the Stormcloak side of the fighting. They clearly never knew what was happening, though those on the upper rolls made a decent attempt to shoot down at us. Unfortunately, they didn't know who or what they were shooting at, and their own fire only added to the chaos. Once the remainder of our forces swooped in, the battle was over in short order. I have to agree with Hadvar on this one. There was no real need to take Winterhold except, possibly, for the general's need to have everything taken care of all nice and tidy. Hadvar and Rika will have the city under control in short order, certainly by the time I make it back to Solitude and report our readiness to go after Jarl Stormcloak on his home territory now. It's been a very long day, and it will be longer by the time I reach Solitude. But it will all be worth it soon. We are coming, my brothers and sisters. We are coming. I made only brief stops on my journey, such as Fort Dunstad, to warm myself. I hadn't seen a fire since I'd talked to Rika in the late hours of yesterday afternoon, and I don't care how used to the cold you think you are, walking in the snow and howling winds of northern Skyrim through the night, even with a very brief time indoors, is going to leave you near dead from the cold. Once I was warmed up, though, it was straight back to the capital city of what would soon be a completely reunified Skyrim, and one that would be free of the Jarl of Eastmarch and his backward beliefs. I was barely able to move my feet when I entered the winking skeever. Though the travel had been easy, the time since I'd last slept was getting increasingly long, and by the time I could think of little more than making it to Solitude so I could rest. Despite the fact that the General needs the final report on Fort Karstav and Winterhold, it would be only that. A final report on something he already knows from couriers at this point. I took the room at the skeever again. Me and this room are getting to be very old friends. 22 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. Only 2 lone blue flags still graced the map of Skyrim. Eastmarch is all that remains in rebellion. The general once again promoted me, this time to legate, again with no command or responsibilities to go with the new rank. I begin to wonder if the rank is an empty one, something akin to being honorary in some fashion. Though I theoretically have the same rank now as Rika, I doubt that I have the same general respect that she does. Then again, I am not in this for the rank anyhow. I departed immediately from Solitude, heading for the far side of Eastmarch, where, with the legate in overall command, we would begin planning for the final fall of Windhelm. But first, I would stop in Whiterun, where Makara should still be waiting for word on her brother. Makara was seated on the floor near the cook fire of the Bannered Mare, a most curious place to be, away from everyone else in the common room. Some people like their solitude, I suppose, and after all she has been through, trusting anyone she does not know would be difficult. I passed on the information I'd gotten from the college, and as I expected, this did little to encourage her. Indeed, she is now even more worried about her brother than she was before. The clues, the book, all lead to a supposed Dwemer ruin southeast of Windhelm, a place possibly called Kagranzel. Apart from the similarity of the name to Kagranach, the most famous of the Dwemer tonal architects, Makara finds it odd that any such ruin is in that region. She claims she never saw one in that area, though she had recently traveled through it. Her initial plan was to go to Candlehearth Hall in Windhelm before setting off to look for her brother. I paused before I spoke, unsure if warning her off of that plan might put the Imperial plans at risk. There is, however, only Windhelm and Fort Amol left in Stormcloak hands, so knowing that the Imperials were likely to be attacking these areas soon would not be a surprise. I therefore passed on that information, leaving out how soon the attacks are likely to be. Makara agreed to wait in Whiterun until she knew the attack was over, one way or the other, before heading there. I think she is hoping that after the war I might go with her on what may be the final step of her search. I'll have to think on it. But meeting her in Windhelm before she sets off is still a good idea, if nothing else, to extend my own well wishes. 23 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. The fog that enshrouded me as I dropped down the mountain pass from Voltheme Towers into Eastmarch assisted me. Knowing that the most likely target for the next Legion assault would be Fort Amol, I left the main road and skirted the fort to remain unseen. Given there was no seeming reaction in the fort as I passed, I take it my efforts were successful. This slowed me down somewhat. I reached the camp as night was falling, claimed my bedroll for the night, and reported my arrival to Legate Rika. She raised an eyebrow at my new rank emblem, but didn't question it. Indeed, the conversation was far more one of equals than I had expected. I gave what I knew of Fort Amol, which she had sent to the troops already on their way. I will be leaving in the early morning to meet up with those troops before we start the assault. From there, I was told, we would immediately start the attack on Windhelm itself. I stopped for a moment, reassessing our troop numbers and what I knew of the city, and declared that we needed more men, which the legate told me I could pass on to the general when he arrived. The general is coming here, and from what I know of him, he will be far less forgiving of excuses than the legate is. 24 Hearthfire, 4th Era, 201. The fight for Fort Amol had just kicked off when I crossed the bridge over the Darkwater River. Arrows flew in sheets, but the Stormcloaks were finally being smart about their defense, and weren't sending melee warriors out. I met up with the troops and then gathered a small group of them to my side, and did the least smart thing we could do. We charged the gates. The barricades fell beneath my flames, falling to pieces in short order, and then we gained the courtyard. Behind us, we could hear the battle cries of the rest of the Legion who had followed us. Followed me, recklessly into battle, and saw the chance for victory present itself. The Stormcloaks could not deny our entry. We pushed our way clear of the gate, spreading out to engage the enemy, taking the walls to clear them of archers. And then, suddenly, it was all over. The bodies of friend and foe alike lay cooling in the chill air of Skyrim, and we were alive. The fort was ours. There was no time for celebration, however. To the north, we heard a long, mournful horn cry. Windhelm was now under siege. I appointed the senior surviving member of the Legion commander of the fort, and raced back to the camp hoping to find the legate. I was out of breath when I tore through the camp to the legate's tent. Her face, when she looked up and saw my less than composed entry, was as fierce as any storm I've seen in the skies over Skyrim. When she informed me in terse, tight words that the general had already arrived in Eastmarch and, rather than join up with the rest of us to march on Windhelm, had decided he'd had enough of waiting and timed his own attack to roughly coincide with the planned assault on Fort Amel, meaning he had just used me and the men with me as distractions, a way to pull attention away from Windhelm while he began the attack, the most important attack, the one that was going after Ulfric Stormcloak. My anger quickly matched that of Legate Rika. Fortunately, she was of a mind with me. We left the tents and the rest of the equipment behind and rushed down the mountains to join in the attack that was already in progress. And we were coming down angry, like elemental fury unleashed. The smoke from the battle was filling the valley. Fiery balls of death, lobbed by catapults, was something I hadn't seen since the Battle of Whiterun. The Legion was arrayed at the bridge that led to the main gates, meaning that despite the distraction that my men and myself had been earlier that day, they hadn't even managed to take control of the bridge. Which also meant I hadn't missed the main event. I might still have my chance at Ulfric. It may have been a brazen action that ignored orders, but at this point, I no longer cared. I snapped up another group of the Legion, and we charged the bridge. I had archers watching the walls above us, 2 more clearing the fighters before us, and it quickly became evident that there would be no reinforcements from the city for those we were fighting. I caught a surprised yell from behind me, likely from the general, but I figured he had 2 choices. Either he followed us, aided us, and took credit for the orders, or he allowed his men to be cut down and decried me in the aftermath. In the first case, I didn't care who got credit. In the second, I'd be dead, and would be even less caring. He chose the first. The charge of the Legionnaires and the battle cry they let loose as they charged the bridge in our wake would have woken the dead. Foot by foot, with my men in the vanguard, we moved forward, cutting down Stormcloak traitors as they appeared or tried to break our formation. When one of our men fell, another took their place, and the momentum took us ever closer. Closer. And then the gates were before us. The Stormcloaks were dead or dying around us. The general shot me a look as he passed me by, but gave no voice to his irritation as he walked to the gates and rallied the men once more. We took a deep breath. We readied ourselves once again. The final push was coming. Ulfric was almost within my grasp. The gates were solid, but they had not been designed to withstand the force of a rage-empowered shout. I stood before the gates and channeled all of my rage, all of my hatred, all of my need into a single use of this magic that even now I barely understood. The blast of force flew from me, and if the gates weren't blown off their hinges, it was more than enough to break the wood bars that were holding them closed. The gates flew open, and the Legion poured through them into the Stormcloak defenses. As I'd half expected, the route straight from the gate to the Palace of the Kings was blocked by a combination of wreckage and improvised barricades. So, too, was the second shortest route, the Grey Quarter. I admit that surprised me. I'd figured Ulfric would be more than willing to let the dunmeri in there die in his defense if he could arrange it. Instead, we had to fight our way through the market quarter, held up briefly at a choke point that led into the graveyard and the Hall of the Dead. The fighting was the worst I'd ever seen. The Stormcloaks fighting like a cornered dog, the Legion fighting with stoic determination. It was somehow fitting that so many would die in the graveyard. Few would be buried here this day, however. There were simply so many of us that there would have been no room left. Through the graveyard we pushed and fought, stopping only briefly to pass the wounded back and the next line of warriors forward. Again, we were nearly fought to a standstill as we entered the noble quarter, where the well-to-do and wealthy kept their homes. I had never seen them in person. Today, they were drowning in flames, some of them personally added as I put away my bow and took up axe and flame in the close quarters demand. Between flame, steel, and the forceful shout I was able to add when I could, we finally pushed through that narrow passage as well, and into the courtyard before the Palace of the Kings. The Palace of the Kings. Long in the past, before Skyrim, before Talos of Atmora, before there was an empire, noble men and women had led the Nords from these walls. From here, Ulfric had hoped to lead a new Skyrim, one free of the Empire, and dedicated to the Nords and the Nords alone. His men had fallen. His allies in the other holds had all surrendered before the might of the Empire. There was no longer anything standing between me and the rebel Jarl, the author of all the evils that I had grown up among. The general was passed forward through the small scattered bits of resistance that remained, and together with the legate, we walked through the doors of the ancient Hall of Noble Power to remove its current resident. We advanced, shoulder to shoulder. The general of the Imperial Legion, bound by honor to destroy the rebel Jarl. A legate of the Imperial Legion, bound by honor to follow the orders of those appointed over her. And a dunmeri of the Grey Quarter, who could care less about honor, about dignity, or about anything except putting an arrow into Ulfric's eyes. The general shouted the charges. He called for the Jarl's surrender. Stormcloak would not go down without a fight, and with his most trusted lieutenant at his side, the two charged the three of us. They did not expect me, however, and the shout that I was quickly learning to harness. As soon as I had the clear line I needed, I threw both of them to the stone floor. Galbeg was dead in moments, the legate putting 3 arrows into his body in the space of a moment. Ulfric, though down and severely injured at this point, was not done, though he was now powerless before us. He was beaten. At last, he finally knew it. He accepted it. Death was waiting for him, and though he likely believed that Sovngarde awaited him, I knew that he was destined for a place far less hospitable for his kind. I only regretted that it would not be me who would kill the man. Or so I'd thought. Stormcloak knew what my shout had meant, had put it together with the call from the throat of the world and the Greybeards. He made a final request, that it be the Dragonborn who does the deed, because it would make for a better song. Like the general, I didn't care about any song that might be written about this moment. All I wanted was this man dead. But since he had asked so nicely, I'd have been a truly rude mer to not fulfill a last man's request, would I not? The general handed me a sword, one he'd been keeping sharp and ready for this occasion. I took it up. stepped before the man who lay groveling on the floor of his own home, waiting for me to deliver the death blow, trying to maintain the air of martyrdom that he no doubt wanted the bards and the singers of songs to remember him as. The truth is not what the bards would have you believe. He did not die in a noble way at all. I pulled him to his feet, made him look me in the eye, to see that the Dragonborn he'd expected to be a Nord was, in fact, a dunmer. His eyes widened in fury and offense. I smiled slightly. Smirked, maybe, would be the better word. The blade I placed crosswise across his throat, its keen edge already drawing the thinnest line of blood. For my brothers and sisters in the Grey Quarter. For the Argonians and Khajiit you have cast from your city as trash. For all those you have wronged, murdered, or ignored. And for me, I whispered. I pulled the sword sideways, slitting his throat open. I would not grant him a clean death. No, he would die slowly, his life pouring out to the ground before him, able to think on how his own actions had now brought about his downfall, to know that it was not a general, not even really a Dragonborn who had ended his pathetic life, but a mer who had until only a month ago been a beggar on his own streets. For a minute or two, he tried to breathe through the blood that now filled his lungs, grasping at his neck as though it would help him to breathe. But at last, he fell still and silent, and his last breath finally passed weakly through the hole I had placed in his throat. Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak of Eastmarch Hold is dead. There were still some small details to deal with. The Empire cannot leave a power vacuum here in Windhelm. Either it would be in constant turmoil, or worse, someone else like Ulfric would rise to power, and we would begin the cycle anew. Though it was not asked of me, I did recommend Freewinter as a possible candidate for the now vacant position of Jarl. Legate Ricka knew of him as well and endorsed my recommendation, and just that quickly, it was done. We stepped from the Palace of the Kings, where the general gave one last speech to his men. It was moving, I'm sure, patriotic, all the things you expect such a speech to be. For my part, I ignored it all. Standing in line with these other two officers of the Empire, and contemplating not the end of the fighting or the rebellion, I pondered instead why, now that I had what I had so desired, it felt so empty. I guessed that perhaps when the rush of the moment was over, when the population of the city that was now freed could again be the people they were meant to be without the foot of the Jarl on their throats, that it would all be worth it. I walked from the gates of Windhelm into the snows. Epilogue. Behold the truth of the matter. The bards up on that stage might call me a hero, the mer who killed a genocidal madman and altered the entire course of Imperial history. And there is some truth to it. The truth, though, is that I was nothing more than a mer who was obsessed with the death of a single man whose importance in the grand scheme of the world was as close to nothing as made no real difference. I had ignored the bigger issues, the return of the dragons, the call of the greybeards, and even the recent rise in vampire numbers, to concentrate on my own selfish wants. The rational among us might call that laudable, but that is not what it means to be a hero. Do not be deceived, however. What I did in that month might have been world-altering, might have been great, but I did not do it for the world. I did it for the same reason that a child might. Because I had been hurt, and thought my hurt was the center of the world. The Civil War was only the beginning of my story, however. More of the story will wait for another night in another tavern. Until then, I will be watching.